Rick's new crime has been exposed. And this time, there's nothing he can deny. Under the flashing lights of hundreds of cameras,
Rick's latest crime has been exposed, and this time, there's no room for denial. Under the gleaming lights of hundreds of cameras, Rick Harrison, the man once hailed as the living legend of Las Vegas, the soul of Pawn Stars, and a symbol of the American dream, collapsed right in the courtroom. No more antiques, no more humorous bargaining scenes on screen. This time, the evidence presented is undeniable. The testimonies, the deals, the invisible bloodstains on each item bought and sold as if they were history. But in truth, they are merely the perfect facade for a series of chillingly sophisticated crimes. Can Rick Harrison's story change? If you want to know the answer, keep watching until the end to understand how an empire can so easily crumble. 1. The man who destroyed the American dream. To understand the moment Rick Harrison fell in the courtroom, we must look back at the journey he has been on, a journey not only symbolizing success, but also the perfect embodiment of the classic American dream. Rick wasn't born into luxury. He grew up in Lexington, North Carolina, in a military family. His father, Richard the Old Man Harrison, was a former Navy officer, strict and introverted. Rick's childhood was intertwined with seizures. Diagnosed with the condition at an early age, he often had to skip school, living isolated from community activities. While other kids played basketball, Rick spent his time reading. He read about war, ancient civilizations, and the value of things others considered worthless. This wasn't just a replacement for an incomplete childhood, it was the foundation for a very different view of the world, where everything holds a story, and that story gives it value. In 1981, the Harrison family moved to Las Vegas, the city of bright dreams, high stakes, and dollars rolling as fast as dice. In this place, where everything is bought and sold quickly, where the past is easily buried under neon lights, Rick and his father embarked on a reverse journey, opening a pawn shop, a place where the past is appraised, preserved, and traded for the future. Gold and Silver Pawn Shop officially opened in 1989. At a modest store near downtown Vegas, they began trading with all kinds of customers, from gamblers and down-and-out players to true collectors. Rick learned to look at an item, not just with the naked eye, but with keen intuition and memory. A small scratch could lower its value by 30%. A miscolored stamp could be fake, worth no more than scrap paper. He had already become famous in the pawn industry before gaining recognition on television. People whispered about the guy Rick, who could glance at a watch for 1 second and know exactly where it came from, what era it belonged to, its current value, and its global transaction history. He didn't need Google. He was Google. By 2009, Rick truly stood out with the reality TV show Pawn Stars. Airing on the History Channel, the show quickly became a phenomenon. Each episode told a small story about an item, a story, a negotiation. Rick wasn't just an appraiser, he was a storyteller. He evoked emotions. Viewers didn't just watch for the value of the objects, but for how Rick brought out emotions from them. A vintage gun wasn't just a tool, it was a relic of war. A 1804 silver dollar was a piece of American financial history. An Abraham Lincoln autograph was a message from the past to the present. Pawn Stars wasn't just a show about antiques. It was where history was reborn through the eyes of someone who never went to college. Rick once said, "I don't need a degree to know which coin is valuable. I just need to know the story behind it." His image became an icon. Rick Harrison embodied the American self-made spirit, starting from nothing, from a disease that pushed him out of society, building a family business, becoming famous, getting a spot on bestseller lists, and being invited to major talk shows. He wasn't a tech billionaire, but he represented millions of hardworking Americans, trading each dollar, building from the lowest foundation. He was the pride of the middle class, those who don't cause waves on the stock market, but who uphold the economy. And that's why, when the news broke that Rick was convicted in an international smuggling case, the shock didn't just come from a cultural shift. It came from the collapse of trust. A man who had once been honored as the unofficial history teacher of America now stood before the court for what is considered one of the most inhumane crimes of the 21st century. Did Rick know he was doing wrong but continued anyway? Or was he simply a victim of his own blind trust in the seemingly legitimate origins of his items? Rick's downfall didn't start at the moment of sentencing. It began earlier, when items started appearing, when history was no longer the real value, but merely a disguise. And like any classical tragedy, Rick Harrison's story is one of a hero stepping into darkness, not because he was bad, but because he believed too much in what he had taught America, that everything has a story. But if that story is distorted, is the storyteller still innocent? 2. When history is a disguise. In Rick Harrison's world, every antique carries a soul, a past, a story, a historical event. However, as Rick once said in an episode of Pawn Stars, history can lie too, and if you're not careful, it will deceive you. Perhaps he never expected that this statement would later become a bitter truth about himself. The troubles didn't appear immediately. They came quietly, like all the gradual falls in life. First, there was a small stone statue from Greece, with the seller not clarifying its origin. Then a hand-drawn ancient map, not listed in any public database. Next was a pocket watch inlaid with jade, supposedly once owned by a post-war Eastern European official. Over time, the items Rick handled became increasingly strange. They seemed priceless, yet also as if they shouldn't exist. What stood out was that they always came with legitimate paperwork. For a business like Gold and Silver Pawn Shop, where hundreds of items are taken in every day, their histories checked, valued, and traded, encountering items that are hard to verify is not unusual. Rick and his team regularly work with experts, use technology, and cross-check with international databases. But like many other industries, over-reliance on procedures can also become a deadly blind spot. An internal investigation report, which was later presented in court, revealed that between 2017 and 2021, more than 142 antiques worth over $10,000 were sold through Rick's system, without their origins being verifiable according to museum standards. Of these, 37 items were flagged by Interpol as warnings, but these alerts came too late or were not synchronized with the store's internal check system. A technology gap, combined with near-total trust in the paperwork from customers, created a loophole for illegal goods to slip through legitimate sales channels. What makes the story even more chilling is that these items were not just ordinary fakes or stolen goods. Some of them, according to the federal indictment, were used as alternative currency in transactions within international human trafficking networks. In other words, these statues, maps, and pocket watches were not just commodities. They were exchanged for transporting, buying, selling, or ransoming people within criminal rings. A notable example is the Byzantine necklace brought into the shop in May 2019. The seller, an Eastern European woman, claimed to be a collector. The necklace was sold for $26,000. Rick personally handled the transaction after reviewing a certificate from a private museum in Prague. Later, investigators determined that the necklace had been part of a stolen collection from a trafficking victim who was brought to the U.S. The woman, Elena, was one of the key witnesses who shocked the courtroom, describing how she had been treated as merchandise in exchange for artifacts. What's worth noting is that in many of these cases, Rick had a gut feeling that something wasn't right. In a leaked internal interview, he admitted, "I had a feeling that some items were off. Not fake, but wrong. But the paperwork was legitimate, the value was high, and we're not the FBI." It was that choice, to trust the process over his instincts, that led him to his mistake. 3. The fateful item. According to the latest leaked documents from the police investigation, in August 2020, a middle-aged man of Hungarian nationality visited the gold and silver pawn shop. He was polite, neatly dressed, and carrying a wooden box covered in leather. Inside was an antique Bible, believed to have been printed in the 17th century in Transylvania. The book still had its original leather cover, with handwritten Latin annotations, along with an envelope containing documents verifying its origin, stamped by a museum in Romania. This book held immense religious, cultural, and historical value to Eastern Europe. The seller spent nearly 40 minutes allowing Rick to examine, compare the lettering, check the paper, inspect the cover structure, and verify the printing details. Everything seemed perfect. When the seller asked for $38,000, Rick did not haggle. He nodded immediately, recorded the transaction under his personal name, and placed the book in the non-display collection, an area reserved for particularly special or confidential items. However, what Rick did not know was that on the same day, an undercover officer from the Federal Human Trafficking Task Force, HTTF, had followed the Hungarian man from the airport all the way to the shop. They had been monitoring him for months, suspecting his involvement in a network that used the trafficking of antiquities to launder money from cross-border human trafficking. 4 days later, Rick received a letter from the Federal Bureau of Investigation, FBI, requesting information about the transaction. They did not specify the reason, only emphasizing that the item was under international investigation. Rick, who was accustomed to working with museums and archaeological organizations, did not feel alarmed. He confidently sent over the complete transaction records, even including photos of the book and the seller. But within the FBI, doubts began to surface. Why would an item recently identified as an illegal trade item in a human trafficking network from the Balkans end up in the hands of Rick Harrison, known for his extreme caution in large transactions? Could it be that he truly knew nothing? Or was this a careful step in a calculated series of actions? A covert investigation was launched. Agents began quietly examining the shop's transaction system and discovered that the Bible was not the first case. Over the past 2 years, 11 antique items from Eastern Europe, the Middle East, and the Caucasus region had entered the store through dubious transactions, mostly conducted by Rick or one of his 3 closest associates. Investigators believed that the Bible was the first domino, not because of its value, but because it helped map out the supply chain, from the illegal transaction point to Rick's store and then to auction or retail markets. A closed-loop trading model was slowly revealed, where stolen or exchanged antiques from human trafficking operations were legitimized through intermediary points, with Rick's pawn shop acting as the gold filtration station. The situation escalated. Rick began receiving mild subpoenas, requests to cooperate, provide records, and clarify certain details in transactions. To the public, no one knew what was happening. Pawn Stars continued to air. Rick still appeared with his familiar deep voice, still appraising flintlock pistols and old Tabu-2 airplane parts with his usual deep knowledge. Only those closest to him, especially his son, Corey Harrison, sensed that something was wrong. Corey once shared in a conversation with a lawyer. He started becoming overly cautious, checking transactions from even last year. Not because he was afraid of making a mistake, but because he was afraid he missed something. Rick began staying up all night, going through documents, calling experts he had worked with to double-check information, but things had gone beyond his control. In March 2021, the FBI officially announced that the gold and silver pawn shop was under investigation for its involvement in a human trafficking network connected to international money laundering, and Rick Harrison, no longer a witness, was now considered a key individual whose level of involvement needed thorough investigation. The story was no longer about a few mislaid items, but about the connection between the Pawn Stars brand and one of the most sophisticated criminal networks operating in Europe, and the US public opinion was still unaware. Rick had not yet been arrested. But he knew the game had begun, and he was the central pawn. For who really holds the power? In the world of antiquities trading, where a Roman coin can be exchanged for a lifetime, and an 18th century map can conceal a human trafficking deal, the line between the legal and the criminal becomes increasingly blurred. After a fateful Bible landed Rick Harrison under the radar of federal investigators, a crucial question began to arise. Was he an active participant, or just a pawn manipulated within a network that even he couldn't control? According to an unofficial source, the FBI discovered a group of special clients from specific countries, regularly bringing in valuable antiquities with proper documentation, and making transactions either directly with Rick or through an intermediary named Victor Marik. This name first appeared on a watch sale invoice in 2018, and since then, he seemed to glide like a shadow through dozens of transactions, each valued at hundreds of thousands of dollars. What's suspicious is that Victor never appeared in any episode of Pawn Stars, was never publicly mentioned by Rick, and wasn't even an official staff member of the shop. However, within the internal system, his name surfaced as a notable VIP client. According to gathered information, Victor Marik, a Czech citizen, was once an antiquities expert for a private gallery in Vienna. Based on European intelligence agencies' records, he vanished from the art scene around 2015, after being involved in a scandal regarding a counterfeit painting worth 1.2 million euros. Since then, no one has known his whereabouts, but international transactions involving rare antiquities continued to surface everywhere, from Istanbul to London, from Prague to Las Vegas. All these transactions shared a common signature, a small slanted M with 3 dashes beneath it. The source also confirmed that the FBI believes Marik to be the man in the shadows, a key intermediary who plays an important role in covering up illicit human trafficking deals. As for Rick, it's possible he met Marik long ago, maybe even not knowing his real name, simply seeing him as a knowledgeable broker with many connections who regularly brought in good deals. One investigator commented in an internal report, "Rick is a man who lives off his instincts, but with Marik, everything was legal on paper. That's why Rick believed, and that's why he was led." This isn't a story of a businessman taking risks for money. This is a story of sophisticated manipulation, exploiting Rick's greatest weakness, his trust in his own knowledge and instincts. The most important piece of evidence was found in an email exchange between Rick and Marik under the pseudonym M. Hawk, using the encrypted email system Proton Mail. In it, Rick wrote, "I'm not feeling too good about the Sumerian mask. It looks like a piece that went missing from the museum last year." And Marik replied, "Confirmed. The mask is from a private collection in Georgia, fully legal. Don't complicate things." This was a sign that Rick had doubts, but still decided to proceed, perhaps due to clever persuasion or maybe because of the pressure from his reputation. Rick couldn't keep rejecting items that could become centerpieces for the next episode on TV. Here, the moral dilemma starts to get complicated. A bread seller doesn't necessarily have to know where the wheat comes from, but an antiquities dealer, dealing with items worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, is an entirely different story. The academic community began to debate, is Rick a victim or an unofficial accomplice? A history of art professor from UCLA commented in The Atlantic, "When you claim to understand the origins of every object, you can't deny your responsibility when one of those objects turns out to be a key to a crime against humanity." What particularly baffled the investigators was that Rick may have suspected, felt confused, but never actively reported it. It was this silence that turned him from a potential witness to the main suspect. Could Rick have feared the impact on his brand? Was he worried about being seen as losing his touch if he couldn't differentiate between what's real and fake, legal and illegal? Or perhaps, deeper down, there's something Rick knows but chooses to conceal? It's in this context, full of suspicion, that an unexpected clue appeared. A copy of a security video from the shop showing Marik entering with a masked woman, who was later identified as a victim of a human trafficking ring from Bulgaria. They didn't bring anything with them. They simply talked with Rick for 7 minutes in his private office. No transaction, no sound from the camera, just gestures, looks, and facial expressions, too difficult to speculate, but enough to raise the hypothesis. Rick might have known more than he admitted. If this is true, the public will no longer be certain of Rick's innocence. Those who once idolized him will begin to split into two camps, defenders and accusers. As for Rick, he remains silent. No interviews, no social media posts, only quietly preparing his case, working with his legal team, because he understands that what's ahead is not just a case. It's a fight for his entire life and reputation. And amidst all these theories, the important question still hangs in the air. Is Rick Harrison the player or the pawn? The deceived or the one who knew but chose silence? 5. The legal battle. Never before had the federal courthouse in Las Vegas been so packed with media. From local news stations to CNN, from the New York Times to German television, everyone was there. The man who had once brought laughter and knowledge to millions of viewers through the small screen was now sitting silently in the defendant's chair, dressed in a light gray suit, his eyes lacking the mischievous sparkle they once held. The camera lenses no longer framed him as a star, but rather captured the image of a fallen icon. Federal prosecutor Sandra Rivas wasted no time setting the tone. In her opening statement, she declared, "The defendant, Rick Harrison, is not merely a careless businessman. He is an active link in a chain of laundering goods connected to human trafficking. And this wasn't an accident. It was a deliberate choice." She presented a chart listing 73 suspicious transactions over a 5-year span, amounting to more than $3.8 million. Among them, at least 16 items were directly linked to human trafficking networks in Europe and Latin America. Images of victims, women, children, were shown on the courtroom projector, one after another. Some of them would testify. A few had vanished without a trace. Rick kept his head down, never looking up. Several in the gallery couldn't hold back their tears. Items once featured on Pawn Stars, once a source of entertainment for so many, now appeared alongside heartbreaking stories, blurring the line between television and crime in a chilling way. Rick's defense attorney, Charles Denning, a former senior prosecutor, took a different approach. He didn't deny the existence of the transactions, nor did he completely challenge the ambiguous origins of some items. Instead, he focused on clarifying legal responsibility. Mr. Harrison runs a business handling thousands of deals a year. He is not a police officer, nor does he have the authority to check immigration records or conduct international investigations. He was exploited by sophisticated, organized, and calculated individuals who knew full well that Rick, because of his fame and television, would take the risk if the paperwork appeared legitimate. Rick's team submitted evidence of past cooperation with authorities, internal procedures for verifying item origins, and multiple instances where Rick had rejected suspicious merchandise. They also released a series of internal emails in which Rick had expressed doubts about a stone statue, though experts had concluded there was no basis to exclude it. However, the prosecution argued that it was precisely his decision to proceed with the purchase despite those doubts that made it so dangerous. He's not stupid. On the contrary, he's very smart. And it's that intelligence that makes him dangerous, because he knows how to legitimize wrongdoing without leaving a trace, Rivas emphasized. The courtroom quickly became a battleground of imagery versus argument. The prosecution painted Rick as cold and calculating, choosing silence to protect his reputation. Meanwhile, the defense portrayed him as being swept into a complex web he was unequipped to combat, tangled in the intricacies of international crime. The public, whether watching from home or gathered outside, remained divided. Some believed Rick was a victim of a hidden power, while others insisted he was part of it. whether he admitted it or not. The turning point came when one of the victims, Elena, the Eastern European woman mentioned during the trial's opening, took the stand. She recounted her journey of losing freedom, being forced across multiple borders, and ultimately being exchanged for an artifact, a Byzantine necklace that had appeared in a 2020 episode of Pawn Stars. I saw him, Rick Harrison, holding that necklace, admiring it, smiling as he spoke to the customer about its beauty. But he didn't know that necklace was the price of my freedom. The courtroom fell into complete silence. Rick raised his head and looked at the witness for the first time. In his eyes there was no defiance, no tears, only a heavy weight. His attorney immediately objected to the direct connection, arguing that Rick had no knowledge of the necklace's origin, but to the public, the damage was already done. This was no longer about money or artifacts. It was about human suffering. In the final days of the trial, an unexpected witness was called. Corey Harrison, Rick's son and his partner on every episode of Pawn Stars. Corey took the stand, his father's eyes watching him with hopeful anticipation. But then, in a voice steady and cold, he said, "I once told my dad, some of those items just felt wrong, but he just told me, don't let emotions interfere with business. Maybe I should have stood my ground. Maybe I'm part of this too." That testimony delivered the final emotional blow. The trial ended under a heavy cloud. Rick said nothing further. The media dubbed it the trial of a generation, a moment when the public was forced to confront the truth that reality television cannot be separated from society's darker sides, and the hero they once admired turned out to be just a man, flawed, conflicted, and at times, dangerous. Was Rick Harrison truly guilty? Or was he just playing a role in a masterfully orchestrated script, one so convincing that even he no longer knew what was real and what was not? 6. Betrayed by loved ones, cracks among comrades. If the legal evidence was a blow from the system, then the betrayal by loved ones felt like a knife plunged straight into the deepest part: trust. For Rick Harrison, the courtroom wasn't just a place where he faced criminal charges, but also where the emotional foundations of his closest relationships began to crumble. The testimony of Corey, his biological son and longtime companion on the journey of Pawn Stars, cut through the already tense air like a razor. Corey didn't raise his voice. He didn't shed a tear. He simply spoke slowly, almost emotionless. "I once warned my father about the items that came from Eastern Europe. They were too eye-catching, too perfect, and appeared too suddenly. But my dad believed that as long as there were proper documents, there wouldn't be a problem." The courtroom fell silent. Rick didn't panic, but he leaned back slightly in his chair as if he had just become aware of a wound he had tried to hide for so long, now exposed and impossible to conceal any longer. From the outside looking in, many might believe Corey was just telling the truth, and maybe he truly was trying to protect his father by clearly drawing the line. I warned him, but I couldn't control him. However, to Rick, that testimony felt like a painful confirmation. Even the person closest to him was no longer on his side. And it wasn't just Corey. A number of longtime employees at the gold and silver pawn shop, people Rick once considered family, also began withdrawing from his legal support team. Chum Lee, real name Austin Lee Russell, who once brought laughter to the show, didn't appear in court and made no public comments. According to media sources, he quietly left Las Vegas to avoid being dragged into a legal battle that could damage his personal reputation. The atmosphere among the group that helped build the Pawn Stars legacy has grown heavy. Those who once appeared on screen together and called each other brothers are now choosing silence, hiring their own lawyers, and gradually stepping away from the brand Rick spent 3 decades building. One of the shop's financial managers, when called to testify, said, "We had our doubts, but Rick usually handled major deals on his own. He trusted his instincts more than any system." That instinct, once seen as a symbol of success, had now become a critical vulnerability. Things got even worse when rumors spread in the press that one of the suspicious deals, the sale of a statue of the Egyptian goddess, was linked to a human trafficking ring. The deal, though not signed under Corey's name, was allegedly facilitated through one of his personal contacts. Some independent investigative bloggers began raising questions. Was there a secret agreement between father and son that Corey was now trying to distance himself from? Corey denied all these accusations, issuing a statement through his attorney saying he was not involved in any illegal activity and was fully willing to cooperate with independent investigations. Still, for Rick, the emotional wound had already become irreparable. In a secretly recorded video of him leaving the courtroom, Rick turned to his lawyer and asked in a bitter whisper, "If even your own son doesn't believe you, what do you have left?" That line wasn't spoken by a defendant. It was the sorrowful cry of a father, once at the pinnacle of success, now helplessly watching those he loved most walk away, like a dream slowly fading into the distance. And yet, there's one notable point. Not a single person close to Rick, not even Corey, has claimed that Rick deliberately broke the law. Everything circles around a shared concern. He ignored advice, put too much faith in himself, and made decisions alone, disregarding warnings from those around him. This paints an even more tragic picture. Rick wasn't a ruthless criminal. He was a smart man, undone by his overwhelming self-trust, and in the process, he dragged his loved ones out of their safety too. Media analysts are calling this the human turning point of the entire story. If Rick had been a schemer, everything would be much simpler to understand. But Rick was a father, a leader, a businessman, someone who had inspired many. And as his inner circle begins to step away, the most painful question is no longer, did he commit a crime? But rather, when did he start losing himself? To the public, Rick Harrison's downfall isn't just the fall of a man standing before a judge, it's the shattering of a value system. From family relationships to workplace bonds to a television audience that once saw Rick as a familiar storyteller, everything is now being tested all at once. This internal collapse might be more painful than anything coming from the outside. When an empire falls, people often think of external threats. But the empire Rick built ultimately crumbled from within, the very place he believed was safest. 7. The truth revealed. In a criminal trial, what is referred to as the truth is not simply a collection of accurate facts. It is something shaped by perspectives, testimonies, evidence, and the ability of one side to convince the jury more than the other. For Rick Harrison, at the final stage of the trial, what he was facing was not just what had happened, but rather the version of the truth that the court and public opinion chose to accept. As the prosecution continued presenting evidence that Rick had dealt in multiple items originating from areas marked red due to ties with human trafficking, his defense team took a more humanistic approach. Rick is not a perfect man. He's a businessman, a television personality, and a father, and he was wrong. Not out of malice, but because he truly believed he was doing the right thing. However, the most devastating blow didn't come from the prosecution. It came from a leaked internal surveillance report, revealing that at least 3 segments of security footage had been erased from the pawnshop's system within 48 hours of key transactions involving Victor Marik. An IT employee was called to testify and stated that he received orders from upper management, but could not confirm whether Rick had personally issued the command. The prosecution wasted no time using this as a major blow to the jury's confidence. A pawn shop that always records footage, yet the most crucial parts go missing? Was that a technical glitch or an intentional act? Rick Harrison may not have been the one who deleted the files, but why didn't he investigate once he discovered the data had vanished? No one had a definitive answer. For most of the trial, Rick chose to remain silent. But in one moment when he stood to address the court, he uttered a statement that left the entire courtroom in silence. "If I was wrong, I'm ready to face the consequences. But if I'm right and still get convicted, maybe this system needs to reconsider how it defines guilt." His words weren't loud, but they struck at the heart of the debate. Did Rick make a mistake, or was he a victim, caught in a legal maze where negligence is treated as intent? Rick's legal team proposed one final option: to accept partial civil liability in exchange for a reduced criminal sentence. It's a common strategy in high-profile cases, a plea deal to avoid the risk of spending decades behind bars. According to some internal sources, if convicted on all counts, Rick could face up to 25 years in federal prison. But by accepting a lesser charge, cooperating and paying damages, he could potentially face only 3 to 5 years and have a chance to rebuild his reputation later on. The night before the trial ended, a mysterious visitor arrived at Rick's lawyer's office. A woman dressed in black, with a hat covering most of her face. She introduced herself as Lyudmila, a former victim of a trafficking ring who was now living legally in the US. She brought with her an audio recording, a conversation between her and Victor Marik from 2020, in which Marik clearly said, "Rick won't know anything. He thinks he's doing a deal with a museum. No one suspects the smart ones." Although the recording wasn't admissible in court due to the way it was obtained, it was enough for Rick to realize one thing: he might have truly been deceived. But did that realization still matter, when he was the one bearing the consequences? The next morning, Rick stood before the court, preparing to deliver his final statement. He could choose to accept the deal, or face a public verdict, carrying all its risks. After days of reflection, Rick chose not to take the plea. "I'd rather be convicted for trusting the wrong person than live my whole life ashamed for lying to escape punishment," he said, locking eyes with the prosecution. The courtroom fell silent. The jury withdrew to deliberate. And Rick, wearing his familiar gray suit, gently closed his eyes. He was no longer the man appraising other people's valuables. Now, he was the one being judged, a man whose worth would be determined by society, and the price might be freedom or the end. More than 8 hours. That's how long the jury took to reach a verdict after nearly 3 weeks of intense proceedings. During that time, Rick Harrison sat quietly in a back room behind the courtroom, holding a briefcase, which, in truth, only contained a notebook filled with the questions he once used on Pawn Stars. No lawyer by his side, no cameras. Just him, a 58-year-old man who had once been the face of a television empire, now waiting to see whether the rest of his life would be spent outside these walls or behind bars. And then, the verdict was read. We, the jury, find the defendant, Rick Harrison, guilty. Just a few words, but they struck like a sword driven into the ground. A sob echoed from the back row. Rick didn't collapse. He didn't cry. He simply let out a sigh, as if the thing he feared most was not the verdict itself, but the confirmation that it was, indeed, the end. Share your thoughts in the comments, because who knows, the next piece of truth might come from you. Don't forget to like and share this video if you believe this story deserves to be heard. And if you're intrigued by real cases, unknown people, and untold mysteries, subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications. We'll be back with more stories to uncover.